Upon our arrival at the Halloween party, it was evident that the festivities had already commenced. My wife and I were immediately drawn to Alicia, whose toned physique was accentuated by her form-fitting Catwoman costume. Despite having recently given birth to our second child, Alicia exuded a striking beauty. I must acknowledge that, on occasion, I find her particularly alluring. I had forgotten how attractive she was. I was dressed like a pirate, which was, of course, original and sexy. However, I was not bad-looking. Alicia gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and went to chat with the other guests. I went to the drinks area, where several of my friends were engaged in a very loud debate. They seemed attractive and tense as soon as I arrived. I was within earshot and quickly discerned the source of the mounting tension. It was a debate that tested the limits of one's intellect, compelling them to think beyond the conventional. The question at hand was a seemingly futile one: Hulk or Superman? I found myself shaking my head at the futility of such debates. One would assume that in a room full of mature, intelligent men, there would be more substantial topics of discussion. The discussion was centered on topics that were not particularly meaningful. It was evident that the majority of the participants believed that Superman was the superior choice. However, the rationale behind this assertion was not clearly articulated. In light of this, I have decided to contribute to this significant debate by offering my expert opinion, which has been developed through a scientific lens through extensive research. During my childhood, I engaged extensively with Marvel and DC comics, which afforded me a superior understanding of the subject matter compared to my peers. I was confident that my insights would resolve the debate definitively. However, the other participants did not fully acknowledge the strength of my arguments. My contributions merely intensified the discussion, which is to be expected when individuals with varying levels of maturity and maturity-related experiences interact. We agreed to postpone the discussion, as there was a considerable quantity of beer and a great deal of enjoyment being derived from the situation. I had planned to remain relatively sober, as I was aware that Alicia was not intending to take us home. We had only just arrived, and I could see that she was already experiencing a high level of enjoyment. She was sitting on the couch next to her best friend, Susie. Susie was also dressed in a costume. As Catwoman, and indeed she had paid as much attention to her costume as Alicia had. Alicia and Susie had been inseparable since middle school. They had lived on the same block as children and were so similar that the only way they could coexist in the same place at the same time was either as best friends or as fierce enemies. They exhibited similar verbal patterns, attire, activities, and even physical characteristics. Both sets of parents were referred to as Mom and Dad by the girls, who often joked that one of their mothers had twins and gave the spare child to another family. The only remaining mystery was to determine which family the child was placed with. It should be noted that the biological mother was, in fact, the butt of the joke. Susie married a man named Dominic, and the couple wed 2 years before Alicia and I did. At that time, we had been married for 6 years. One might assume that, given the similarities between the two girls, they would marry the same men. However, this was not the case. Susie's husband was. He is my complete opposite. I am a person who does not engage in much physical labor at work. Dominic, on the other hand, works with his hands all day. I am the district manager for 6 local restaurants that my company owns. While I may not be a suit-and-tie person, I am usually at worst businesslike. For those who are curious, I am not a nerd or I engaged in baseball during my secondary education and boxing during my tertiary education. However, my boxing was more of a leisure activity than a profession. It did, however, maintain my physical fitness. After I married and established a family, I did not spend as much time at the gym, but I was not overweight and remained physically fit. Dominic, on the other hand, in contrast, Dominic's occupation is in a local factory. His official specialty is unclear, but it is evident that his role involves frequent lifting of heavy objects for extended periods, up to 8 to 10 hours per day. Additionally, he maintains a highly active lifestyle, spending a significant amount of time at the gym. This is reflected in his muscular physique, in stark contrast to my own relatively short, neat hair. His hair is worn in a ponytail, which serves to further accentuate his resemblance to an Aztec warrior. Dominic bears a striking resemblance to the character Drogo from the television series Game of Thrones, whereas I am more reminiscent of the character Don Draper from the television series Mad Men. I never really formed a close bond with Dominic. I did not dislike him, but we did not have a strong enough connection to be considered close friends or even casual acquaintances. From my perspective, he was Susie's husband, given that Susie was my wife's closest friend. I occasionally observed him, but I have never sought such interactions nor felt a desire to do so. I am confident that he held a similar view of me. On this occasion, he was, of course, attired as Tarzan. Given the low temperature, he had arrived at the gathering wearing a loincloth. The loincloth is a garment that I associate with a certain degree of obnoxious behavior. Tarzan was in the company of the women, as was his custom at such gatherings. He was quite forward and often crossed the line of propriety. However, neither woman appeared to take umbrage at his overtures. The sexual innuendos often elicited a giggle and blush response from the women, rather than a slap. Even Alicia seemed amused by his actions. One might assume that Susie would find this behavior awkward. I know Alicia would have reacted similarly if it weren't for my intervention. However, Susie simply laughed along with them. On occasion, she would playfully pat him on the shoulder. She would simply shoulder him and say, "Dominic, stop it," but she never really admonished him or even looked at him angrily. She seemed proud that women lusted after her husband. Dominic was in a playful mood that night. He had consumed enough alcohol to lower his already slight inhibitions, so his flirting was palpable, directed at both single and married women. It was of no consequence to him that he grabbed their breasts, groped their buttocks, and rubbed their genitals. I have observed that several husbands became enraged when their wives became the object of such attention. However, no one reacted to it. Perhaps they were afraid of him. Perhaps they were intoxicated. Perhaps they simply did not wish to create a commotion. I am not. However, I remained alert and attentive to any potential interactions between Dominic and Alicia. Any display of disrespect or inappropriate behavior from Dominic would have resulted in immediate departure from the premises. I sensed Alicia's awareness of my unease, approaching me with a question. "Are you enjoying yourself, Greg?" she inquired, her voice audible due to the music. I acknowledged her presence with a nod and took a sip of beer. I observed her movements to the music, her body swaying in rhythm. As the music played, I observed that Alicia's gaze shifted to Tarzan without her realizing it. She silently assessed his body. I felt a sense of unease, a realization that I did not want her lust to be directed towards him. I admit that I started to feel jealous. I questioned my own idiocy, wondering why she would dress up like Tarzan when it was cold outside. Alicia suddenly snapped out of her trance and turned to me. It is important to note that Dominic should always be the center of attention. I allowed myself a brief chuckle before taking another sip of beer, which suddenly lost its taste. Alicia noticed the change in my sour mood. "Honey, don't tell me you're jealous." "Why would I be jealous of him?" "I don't feel the need to go out naked to attract women." Alicia laughed. She replied with a dismissive tone, "Of course not." As the evening progressed, more alcohol was consumed, which further diminished the inhibitions of those present. Dominic and his loincloth became less prominent as I engaged in conversation with my genuine companions. At some point during the night, Dominic began to make advances towards Alicia. I was unaware of Dominic's advances toward Alicia until I sought her out, as I had not seen her for some time. I discovered her in the kitchen with Dominic, who stood close and conversed in hushed tones. I found the proximity and volume of their voices to be overly intimate, and my jealousy immediately surfaced. Dominic noticed me first, and I observed him retreat. From a reasonable distance, Alicia must have sensed the change in atmosphere because she turned around and saw me too. She attempted to smile at me warmly, but it seemed forced. "Hello, darling," she said quickly, "I was just looking for you." Her tone was accusing, although I tried to hide it, she said, her voice betraying her unease. I could sense her desire to avoid further confrontation. Dominic, seemingly aware of my presence, departed swiftly and quietly, leaving us alone. "Are you angry with me, honey?" she asked, her tone betraying her innocence. "What were you two discussing in that corner? I find you there, whispering like two teenage girls with a secret. What is going on, honey? Stop. It is nothing. There is no issue between me and Dominic. He was simply being flirtatious as usual. There is no cause for concern. What are you referring to as panties in a bunch?" I am perplexed by your use of this expression. It is unclear to me what you intend to convey. I am merely expressing my feelings. I am not upset. I am simply sharing my emotions. I am not offended. I am not bothered. I am not upset. I am not distressed. I am not concerned. I am not worried. I am not anxious. I am not nervous. I am not upset. I am not bothered. I am not concerned. I am not worried. I am not anxious. I am not nervous. I am not upset. I am not bothered. I am not concerned. I am not worried. I am not anxious. I am not nervous. I drunk honey, don't mind me with these words. She patted me on the cheek and left. Dominic and Alicia were not seen together for the rest of the night. I observed them closely and noted that they appeared to avoid each other. I did see them exchange mysterious glances, but that was the extent of it. This was more than sufficient to arouse my suspicions. I began to feel uneasy, as though I were being watched. I decided to take a break and go upstairs to relieve the pressure. When I emerged from the bathroom, I encountered Dominic. As if he had followed me here and was waiting for me. "Do you have a problem with me, Greg?" he asked, slurring his words and looking into mine with a menacing gaze, as if attempting to intimidate me. What I perceived in that moment seemed surreal. In fact, something about this entire night seemed somewhat unusual. I inquired if he had. "Do you have a problem with me?" he asked, his eyes fixed on mine with a menacing glint. "You, with your luxury car and house, always flaunting your wealth, do you think you're better than me? If this conversation seems perplexing to you, you're not alone." I was initially at a loss as to where this line of questioning was leading. "You're drunk, Dominic. Go home before you say something you'll regret." He will regret what he said, pushing past him and saying something like, "Sleeping sweetly with your pretty wife." Now he has my attention. I turned and walked towards him until we were millimeters apart. "Shut up. Don't make me act like my suit. I'll kill you. Leave my wife out of any of your sick fantasies." He regarded me with a grin, as if I were a fool. "I have memories." The last words he uttered seemed to reverberate like thunder, and so it was. This marks the conclusion of our discussion. His words reached me, though I was not as certain as I would have been before the party. What about the mole on her thigh or the fact that she is not a natural blonde? Of course, one cannot say that now, since she has tidied up her hair. That was the last thing he said. The only other sounds that could be heard were the sickening thud of bone on bone that a fist makes as it connects firmly to the jaw, followed by the sound of 195 pounds punching through the drywall. I proceeded to descend the staircase at a pace that could be described as raging bull-like. Upon reaching the bottom, I located Alicia. She approached me with haste, her query momentarily suspended on her lips. A single glance at me was sufficient for her to discern my knowledge of her identity. Her eyes, which were widely dilated and filled with tears, provided confirmation of the veracity of Dominic's statements. In that moment, I was overcome with the urge to call for emergency assistance. Dominic is unconscious and cannot be resurrected. I heard screams from above, though I am unsure of the identity of the speaker. I remained stationary, regarding Alicia with a gaze that seemed to convey a depth of emotion. People began to ascend the stairs, seeking to ascertain the situation. I continued to stare at Alicia, searching for the woman I had married was, at that moment, indifferent to the question of Dominic's well-being. I was seized by an overwhelming urge to know the truth about my husband's actions. I heard a scream emanating from behind me, followed by the sound of small fists striking my back. I swiftly turned to avoid being struck by a small figure, who was swinging at me with great force. Someone managed to grasp her and pull her back. "Greg," I heard a voice cry out. I was asked by my friend Richard, who was the host of the party, about my knowledge of Dominic's infidelity. Richard is the owner of the wall, which has a hole in it that is approximately the size of Dominic. I ignored him and turned to Susie. I inquired if she was aware that her husband had engaged in an affair with Alicia. Susie became silent and ceased her verbal assault on me. She regarded me with a gaze that seemed to convey a multitude of emotions. This provided a rationale for her behavior, yet she did not express any negative emotions. She did not accuse me of lying, and most importantly, she did not look at Alicia. Instead, she looked at me with a knowing gaze. I sensed that she had discovered something about me as well. I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Greg, we need to talk, but not here." I turned around and gave Alicia the coldest look I could muster at that moment. I experienced a profound and intense anger that I had never previously encountered. It was a blinding, white-hot rage, so strong that tears flowed from my eyes, although I did not actually cry. The tears seemed to serve as a kind of release, preventing me from exploding in anger. He woke up, and I heard a shout from above. Susie left Alicia and me and flew. I proceeded to ascend the stairs to be in proximity to her. I was overcome with a sense of remorse and regret. The stark reality of the situation suddenly became apparent. I was acutely aware that my actions could potentially result in dire consequences. Even though I did not intend to harm Dominic, one moment of anger could have dire and irreversible consequences. I was already facing the possibility of being charged with assault, which could have a detrimental impact on my career. The considerable effort I had invested in my work could have been undone as a result of my loss of temper with a person under the influence of alcohol. This individual had also been involved in an intimate relationship with my wife, Greg. It was evident that a solution was required, and I was prepared to leave the situation. However, I was informed that I was to return home with Alicia and her husband. I was not willing to comply with this directive and proceeded to leave the premises. Alicia pursued me in a state of desperation and grasped my arm. "Greg, you will not abandon me here. We are going home to engage in discourse. Can you hear me? You will not surpass me in this interaction." Her countenance was marked by tears, a complex expression of anger and profound sadness. I am uncertain as to the exact nature of her emotional state. She was supposed to be angry about something. I could already be facing legal consequences for assault. I did not want to add domestic violence to this. "You, Greg, do you want to hit me? Do it. At least you will not ignore me. This will be the first time you touch me." In the preceding weeks, she had become increasingly angry, and I was uncertain as to why she was the one expressing this emotion. I was the only one who had the right to be angry. Was this her rationale? Did I not come home and caress her every night? Was this her justification? Was this her rationale? The rationale behind her infidelity was not explicitly articulated, however, her demeanor was unmistakably defiant. For the record, I am gainfully employed, and I do not have a spouse to shoulder the financial responsibilities. Perhaps if you obtained employment, you would understand the exhaustion that often accompanies the end of the workday. At that moment, I was acutely aware that we were not alone. And I can assure you that they were all ears. The only thing missing was the bucket of popcorn in their hands. Alicia was actually making fun of me. Greg, who is too tired to make love to his wife, nevertheless finds time to sit in front of his computer and watch adult movies every night. Perhaps if he ceased looking for silicone, if he had paid more attention to his wife, perhaps he would not have had to resort to seeking solace from his friend, who was already aware of his lack of interest in their marriage. By this time, Alicia was practically screaming at the top of her lungs, her fists clenched at her sides, and her tear-stained face reflected pain. I was overcome with a sense of anger and humiliation. I was at a loss for words and unable to formulate a response. I attempted to speak but could not find the appropriate words. Those around me, including friends and neighbors, observed me with expressions that conveyed their feelings of shock, disgust, and sympathy. The observers expressed a range of emotions, including shock, disgust, sympathy, and entertainment. I was compelled to turn on my heels and depart, and Alicia's despairing cry followed me until I started the engine and drove away. This account is based on actual events, as may be inferred from the narrative. For the sake of clarity, I should note that I am not the character of Greg in this story. I am Richard, the individual who organized the Halloween party that resulted in the aforementioned incident. I have created a narrative from the perspective of the main character because I felt it would evoke the anger and humiliation that Greg experienced. I had to put myself in his shoes when I wrote this. I was compelled to discuss the matter further. Indeed, it has been a topic of discussion in our household ever since I became aware of the situation. I am aware that it is unethical to become so emotionally invested in a case like this, but I found myself unable to stop thinking about it. It was as if I was watching a train wreck and unable to look away. Susie did not appear angry when Greg informed her that Alicia was asleep. Given Dominic's presence, it was evident that the situation was not simply a threesome. Rather, it was a more complex arrangement. It is difficult to determine the duration of such a scenario. Additionally, there were discernible interactions between Alicia and Dominic at the gathering. These exchanges suggested the presence of a developing dynamic between them. It is possible that these observations are the result of overthinking the situation. However, it is also plausible that there was more to it than initially apparent. It is evident that Greg was failing to satisfy Alicia's sexual needs, if not more. Could this be a pretext for infidelity? It seems unlikely. Does this account for her infidelity? It may be the case that women who consistently experience rejection of their sexual advances are more likely to engage in extramarital relationships, particularly if their husbands display sexual interest in other women. It can be argued that other women watching adult movies with her could be considered cheating if it makes one's spouse feel betrayed and inadequate. It is my opinion that Alicia is very attractive in real life. It is likely that a man would have to be dead not to show any interest in her. This supports the idea that there is a saying that for every beautiful woman, there is a man who is tired of having sex with her. It is evident that the man in question has grown weary of engaging in sexual intercourse with her. The pivotal question, therefore, is what will transpire next? At this juncture, the four individuals involved have chosen to maintain silence regarding the prevailing circumstances. However, it is inevitable that this matter will eventually come to light, given the nature of the situation. Although this narrative is based on a true story, I did not witness every detail of the incident, therefore, I had to take creative license with some aspects of the narrative. For instance, I did not hear the exact conversation between Greg and Dominic. I heard from other sources that the exact wording of the conversation had to be embellished. I obviously did not have access to information about what was going on in Greg's mind. However, I was aware of what would be going on in my mind. If I were in his position, I would simply accept the situation. I empathize with him and the difficult choices he has had to make. Alicia treated him unfairly, regardless of her reasons. I am uncertain if I am seeking reconciliation or divorce in this situation. I must acknowledge that I am somewhat biased, as Greg is a friend of mine and, of course, Superman. I concur with Greg's assessment. Thermal vision and super speed are not viable options in this context. Unless there is kryptonite present, there is no competitive advantage. I am unsure of the relevance of this information, Mr. Chiron. Who is calling on line 1? Mr. Ford is calling for you, sir. Greg has been trying to contact you since the explosion at my Halloween party. Until now, his wife and 2 other lovers had remained silent. No one heard a sound from them, of course, and there were many questions. How could this not happen? The showdown was so public and humiliating, even cruel. It had all the elements you would want in a drama, violence, betrayal, an epic showdown between David and Goliath are all present, but this time, Goliath has a vulnerable spot and has made a foolish promise that he cannot keep. David has taken advantage of this and is filled with hatred. He has also been publicly humiliated by his wife. If he were not upset, I would be somewhat concerned. Thank you, Betty. I will handle this. I waited for the audible signal that indicated I was connected to Greg. Despite his outward calm, I could discern a residual anger beneath the surface. Even over the phone, his emotions were palpable. I then inquired as to his willingness to engage in discourse. In response, I heard him chuckle, which seemed more like a snort. I then asked him why he would want to converse with me. His response was that he wanted to post my story online. The author's compelling narrative merits a sequel. Readers are eager to learn the fate of the unfulfilled spouse and the repercussions faced by the individual who was unable to satisfy his wife. It is reasonable to assume that the loyal audience will be invested in seeing how the protagonist's life progresses. The individual in question has now read the author's work and is not only displeased with his unfaithful spouse but also with her unfaithful best friend and her Neanderthal-like partner. Greg and I attended the same high school. He played baseball and I played football. Despite our shared experience, we lost touch with each other after graduation. He proceeded to college, while I enlisted in the Air Force. After graduating from high school, he returned to our hometown and obtained employment as a manager at Olive Garden. This appeared to be a suboptimal use of his college degree. However, he was persistent and he was soon promoted. He demonstrated excellence in all of the roles he was given, and his performance metrics were consistently strong. He soon became a district manager, responsible for multiple restaurants. His salary now rivaled mine. After 10 years of service in the Air Force, I was honorably discharged and promptly employed by a company with military contracts. In summary, I returned to my hometown, reconnected with Greg, and our friendship resumed as if there had never been a break. Consequently, my friend was enraged with me. Greg, normally, would attempt to make a witty joke to alleviate the situation or at least ease the tension. Unfortunately for me, it was evident that in this situation, it would not be. The interaction was unproductive. I was particularly struck by the ending, in which he interrupted me. I was at a loss for how to respond and ultimately chose to remain silent and allow him to continue speaking. I felt like I had backed down and retreated from the situation, akin to a coward. His sarcasm was particularly impactful, evoking a sense of self-reproach. I was acutely aware of my shortcomings as a friend. Defense against this, Greg. Where are you? We need to talk. Richard, I have recently experienced a significant increase in popularity. I am now more sought after than I was previously. It appears that I am in high demand for social interaction. I attribute this to my affable personality. At that moment, I became aware of a peculiar phenomenon. His speech was noticeably slurred. I could discern the sounds of liquid was poured and hit the glass walls of the glass. Greg, are you drunk? He laughed sardonically. No, Richard. I was drunk an hour ago. I donned my coat and retrieved my keys. My schedule was full at the moment, but that was of no consequence. I informed Richard that I would not divulge my whereabouts. He was advised to refrain from searching for me at this establishment. If he did so, I would be forced to take action. The line went silent. Nevertheless, I was certain of his location. There were only a few bars in the vicinity. Greg had his own preferred establishment in our city, Mo. His affection for the attractive bartender was well known. She possessed the ability to engage in flirtation while simultaneously conveying a sense of exclusivity. Despite this, her popularity remained undiminished. Upon entering the establishment, I observed that he was the sole patron at the bar. I noted that he was the only visitor there. Upon glancing at my watch, I realized that it was only the afternoon. Karen acknowledged me with a wave when she saw me enter. I could discern a compassionate quality in her eyes as they met mine. "Does this handsome, the stallion belongs to you?" she joked, but the smile did not reach her eyes. I nodded softly and tilted my head to the side, indicating that I needed her to disappear and give us a minute. Greg, that was all I could get out. His fist slammed into me, and I saw stars. Damn it, I thought. No wonder Dominic was hurt so badly. Once I was on the floor, wiping blood from my lip, he stood over me, looking at me angrily. Finally, he shook his head and returned to his place at the counter. I got up from the floor and waved to Karen, who was clearing tables. Now, she stood and looked at us with eyes as big as saucers. She started before I could even finish my thought. She approached, nodding silently to indicate that she understood. She then went back to clearing tables. Now that is out of the way, may I inquire as to whether we might engage in a discussion? She asked, sitting down next to him. He took another sip of his beer and shook his head, indicating that he was not interested in discussing the matter further. I found myself amused at his continued lucidity. This was a promising sign. In any case, this was already a situation where one should cease. "Do you and your mother get along?" he asked, his tone laced with disdain. "You met my mother, right?" "Yes, I distinctly recall how she searched me to ensure I didn't bring any prohibited substances into her house." Substances to her house, we laughed about it together. Greg took another sip and then looked me in the eyes. I was extremely embarrassed to have been subjected to such an experience and then to read about it and discover that all my friends were aware of it. "I did not wish to cause you further humiliation, of course." No one will know it's you, I posited, attempting to persuade both Greg and myself that the incident would not be revealed. I then proceeded to enumerate the various parties at which such an occurrence might have transpired, concluding that the majority of them would be similar. Greg's demeanor suggested that he was contemplating another physical altercation. It was at this juncture that I realized the futility of attempting to maintain a sense of humor in the face of such adversity. This is amusing, I concede. However, humor is not always the most effective response in such situations. You are correct, Greg. I was an __, and I am genuinely sorry for putting you in an uncomfortable position. However, I am not sorry for striking you. I laughed and said, you still strike like a __. No wonder you always lost when you. The ice was broken and the situation continued to unfold. I was able to remove him from Mo's presence and into my vehicle. Karen expressed gratitude and embraced me as we departed. I implored Richard to take care of him. He was experiencing significant distress. My jaw was throbbing and beginning to swell, but I reached Greg, which was the most concerning aspect of the situation. Once he was secured in the passenger seat, he lost consciousness. It appeared as though he had not slept for days. Instead of taking him to his mother's residence, I transported him to mine. En route, I contacted another acquaintance, John. He inquired about Rich's well-being in a cheerful tone. John was one of those individuals who still I had assumed he was in his 20s. He was a great guy, although he was very immature. I emphasize very, since most guys are at least a little immature. He was the one who initiated the entire Hulk versus Superman debate. He is always the life of the party. However, none of the wives really want their husbands to revolve around him. He had a habit he often encouraged his friends to engage in mischievous behavior, much to the dismay of their parents. I am contacting you, John, because I require assistance in transporting Greg to my residence. He is currently at Mo's and I am seeking your help in facilitating his admission to my home and subsequent placement in bed. He appears to be completely disengaged from the world. I am grateful that you have located him. I have been searching for him throughout the week, following the unfortunate incident that transpired. It is remarkable that he has survived. He did not resort to lethal force. John parked his vehicle, a Mustang, behind my own vehicle, a Tahoe, in my driveway. We then proceeded to lift a considerable weight, approximately 200 pounds, and place it on the couch in my basement. This was no simple task. We conversed for a while and he subsequently departed, having promised to inform me of developments upon my return home. The house was quiet and I was alone. This was unusual, as it was rare for me to be home alone. I was unsure of what to do with myself. I did not want to leave the house in case Greg woke up. I did not want him to be confused about where he was. Therefore, I prepared a meal. I grilled the steak on the George Foreman grill and baked the potatoes. I proceeded to view my cable sports package in order to ascertain whether any noteworthy games were being broadcast, or at the very least, engaging discussions about said games. After some deliberation, I selected a documentary and commenced my gourmet meal. It was not long before my wife, Nikki, arrived at the house with our children in tow. "Darling," she inquired, "what are you doing at home so early?" she inquired, kissing him on the cheek. The children proceeded upstairs. I discovered Greg at Mo's in a state of inebriation. I had brought him here and assisted him in descending to the basement. Her expression immediately exhibited indecision. "Are you certain this is a prudent decision?" I am reluctant to permit any behavior that might be perceived as inebriated in the presence of the children. I am confident he will be fine, dear. I will ensure he remains so. In line, she stroked my cheek, and I shuddered. At that moment, she became aware of the extent of her injuries. "Richard, what did he do to cause this?" "Me, I'm fine, honey." "Forget about it." "Richard, get him out of here, honey." "Everything is fine." A man recently discovered that his wife was cheating on him. The incident occurred in such a public manner that it is reasonable to conclude that anyone in his position would experience feelings of embarrassment. Additionally, he is prone to emotional outbursts, having experienced a significant personal tragedy recently. I am his friend and have been aware of his distress. I am not invulnerable and have experienced similar distress. My resilience is not as high as one might expect. It would be prudent for him to consider alternative strategies next year. Nikki found this assessment amusing. It was amusing to observe Tarzan being bested by a pirate. Jane would likely not have been pleased. Tarzan did, in fact, receive what he deserved. Dominic should devote less time to weightlifting and more time to hitting the punching bag. Nikki laughed heartily, or at least learned to dodge. We laughed together when she had calmed down. One of the most endearing qualities of Nikki is her personality and sense of humor. This is one of the reasons why it is challenging to remain angry at her for extended periods. I proceeded downstairs to ascertain the well-being of Greg. His thunderous snoring indicated that he was still alive, at least in the sense that his heart was still beating. However, his condition was essentially that of a comatose state. He remained in a state of functional comas. I placed a pillow under his head when he emitted a sound that would have roused the dead. The fumes from his alcohol consumption would have killed everyone in the vicinity. What an extraordinary state of affairs, I muttered to myself. I needed to extricate myself from this situation. A few hours later, a zombie, bearing a striking resemblance to my friend, emerged from the individual in question, exhibited eyes that were bloodshot and appeared to scream death and decay as he shuffled around the kitchen. Nikki, upon seeing him, gave me a silent warning that spoke volumes. She advised me to keep him in line or he would leave. I stood up and went to the kitchen to greet him. I inquired about his well-being, stating, "It's like my wife cheated on me." He then proceeded to humiliate me in front of all our neighbors before ultimately running over me with a truck. At least your memory is intact, 2 out of 3 is not bad. His eyes narrowed and I could see that he was trying to recall something. I asked him if he remembered how I had hit him in the face for that. He rubbed his jaw and I could see that he was still in pain. This part seems vague. It is possible that this action may need to be repeated in order to be absolutely certain that it was completed. Despite his stated intention to strike me again, there was no discernible force in his words. I was confident that he would not act on this desire. I have previously stated this, but I am genuinely remorseful about this account, Greg. I did not anticipate that a significant number of individuals would access the location where it was posted, and I did not anticipate that I was incorrect in my assumption that the story would remain unknown. In fact, it has been read by multiple individuals. One such individual is a person I know who heard about the party from someone else and then read the story online. This person is not someone you are acquainted with. He is a man named Harry who lives in Virginia. I found this information amusing. Do you know who this person is? Harry Ena, have you heard of him? He is a pleasant fellow, although he does have a somewhat disagreeable demeanor. However, he was quite supportive of me and also expressed his opinion that you are a disagreeable person. I should note that he smiled, and I am fairly certain that he held that opinion prior to reading the story I wrote about you, Greg. He nodded and laughed, but I did not slap him on the back. It was evident that this was not a desirable outcome, so I was aware that we were in a satisfactory position. Richard, why did you have to make me appear to be such a weakling? Did I really just leave without any consideration for the situation? Greg, you were able to resolve the issue with minimal effort. I was concerned that you would have resorted to more aggressive tactics if you had been in a similar situation during your college years. You would have been well positioned to succeed. Nobody considers you a weakling. It was merely a pastime I did not particularly enjoy. He grinned and shook his head. I truly bested him. He added with humor, there was a mixture of pride and laughter in his voice. Undoubtedly, you could not have done that. He playfully nudged me with his elbow. No, I could not. He was unable to contain his mirth. It was encouraging to see Rich. What occurred after I departed? I gazed over my shoulder for a considerable duration, anticipating being taken into custody. Greg, following your departure on October 31st, the post-celebration with Alicia was marked by a profound sense of despair. She collapsed to the floor, emitting a loud series of sobs. Her slender body was a visible manifestation of her distress. The sight of Catwoman lying on the floor, a broken figure, was a surreal one. Nikki rushed to her side and helped her up. She then led Alicia over to the couch and sat down next to her. Catwoman's second-in-command, Susie, descended the stairs at a slow and deliberate pace, accompanied by a disgraced Tarzan. He held his head and his wife embraced him, guiding his movements. Alicia observed this and became enraged. She immediately stood from the sofa and advanced towards them with great haste. "What did you tell Greg?" she demanded. "You have ruined my life." Tarzan, who had already been assaulted by the pirate, was now evading Catwoman's attacks. Catwoman number 2 attempted to intervene. "Elise, cease and desist." Susie interjected, defending her husband Tarzan. The act of being saved by a woman from another woman only served to further inflame Tarzan's already rebellious spirit. It would have been prudent to intervene at an earlier juncture. No was the only response he could muster. The jungle man regarded Alicia with a detached expression, as though he was trying to comprehend the situation. It became evident that he was still in a state of inebriation. The knockout must have sobered him up. He was fully aware that he was the source of today's distress. "Alicia, I'm sorry, I was drunk." She ceased her assault and collapsed to the floor once more. "What is the appropriate course of action now, Susie? What should I do now?" The scene shifts to Richard's kitchen. After that, they had to transport Dominic to the emergency room, where it was determined that he had sustained a concussion. He expressed a desire to press charges, but Susie and Alicia dissuaded him from doing so. Alicia implored him not to proceed with this course of action, recognizing that an arrest would significantly diminish the likelihood of his return. Greg responded with a derisive chuckle and a shake of his head. "In any case," he said, "there is little hope for this." I nodded in sad agreement. "Greg," I asked, "what transpired after you departed?" "We had only heard the sound of rubber striking the road. The road and the roar of your engine prompted me to pursue you, but my tower was occupied by other vehicles. I was concerned that you might have an accident. You have not responded to any of our calls. I needed to leave the situation and take some time to process it." Our friends all looked at me, and I could see that they were concerned. I am prepared to be judged. I needed space, so I went to my mother's house. It must have been a rather traumatic experience for you to return there. Indeed, life presents us with challenges that we must face. The only way to deal with these challenges is to do something that we would not normally do. Greg. October 31st after party, _______________________ I proceeded to navigate the surrounding area with a high level of intensity, traversing various side streets. It is worth noting that I was uncertain of my ultimate destination. The presence of regulatory signage, including stop signs, speed limit indicators, and traffic signals, did not influence my driving behavior. I operated the vehicle with a sense of urgency and importance, as though I were the sole entity with a right to be on the road. I was unaware of the specific auditory stimulus that had initially captured my attention until I turned my head and observed upon recognizing the ringtone, I realized it was Alicia calling. Her beautiful face illuminated the screen of my Android device. She smiled at me, a loving smile. I remember taking this photo. I was so happy, so full of love and adoration. However, I had to resist the urge to throw my phone. The image of her on the screen was a false representation of reality. If I answered the call, the voice on the other end would also be a fabrication. The cheerful melody that announced her intention to contact me was a further indication of her deceit. She had indeed slept with Dominic and probably kissed him passionately. However, this was not the whole truth. He was a deceitful individual who had engaged in an adulterous relationship with another man's wife. I, on the other hand, had provided her with unwavering support and companionship during her illness. I was present in the delivery room on 2 occasions, holding her hand and wiping her sweat. I had pledged to love her through sickness and in health. I had dedicated my life to her. The persistent ringtone continued to torment me with its deceptive messages. It ceased for a moment, only to resume shortly thereafter. I terminated the call and removed the battery, effectively ending the lie. I proceeded to traverse the city in a seemingly endless loop, driven by a sense of aimlessness. My mind, overwhelmed by the incessant stream of thoughts, appeared to have entered a state of autopilot. The excessive streaming of video footage of the events of the night, coupled with the even more distressing hypothetical scenarios involving my wife and the jungle __, caused my processor to overheat. It was only when I regained my senses and observed my parents' garage in front of me that I realized I did not recall driving there. It would seem that my subconscious had transported me back to the place of my childhood. I turned off the engine and went inside. It is a common experience for children to have a key to their parents' house, even if they have sworn never to return. This may not apply to every child, but I did so because it was late. The living room in which I grew up was dark. It is evident that the physical environment has remained unaltered over the past decades. The sofa, coffee table, and lamp, along with their accompanying items, were precisely as I remembered them from my childhood. I was able to navigate the space with my eyes closed, a sensation that was both reassuring and comforting. That night, however, proved to be a significant turning point in my life. I have always been skeptical when people recount stories where their entire world is transformed in an instant, except in the case of a tragic event. That night, however, made me a believer. Everything I had known about my life was suddenly turned upside down by a single drunken conversation with an individual who was, by all accounts, a Neanderthal. The experience led me to seek solace in the familiar environment in which I had grown up. After experiencing a significant disruption, such as an earthquake, it is natural to seek stability and security. In this situation, I found that having a sense of calm and stability was crucial. I was fortunate to be in a safe environment, at home. I heard my mother's voice calling out to me, envisioning her crouched in the corner with a baseball bat. I was prepared to repel an unwelcome visitor with force if necessary. It was I, Gregory, who had experienced a sudden, intense illumination that had momentarily impaired my vision. I had to narrow my eyes to avoid losing sight. Why, I wondered, were you lurking in the darkness? Were you attempting to kill me by causing a heart attack? I was gratified to find that this was indeed the case. I then saw my mother, who was wearing floral pajamas and her hair tied up in curlers. I inquired as to why she was there so late and why she was dressed in such a manner. She replied that she had forgotten that I was still wearing most of my pirate costume. I had misplaced my hat, my parrot, and my eye patch, so I now appeared to be in a somewhat inebriated state. I proceeded to inform her of my intention to remain at the residence for the remainder of the evening. The children would be departing shortly, but I would be staying on. I would provide an account of my experiences, but I requested that we refrain from discussing them in the presence of the children. I was aware that I had not done so. I simply informed her of my intentions. This may appear peculiar to the majority of individuals, but not to us. My family is not what one might refer to as a sweethearts. My father is a straightforward individual who speaks only when necessary and expects the same in return. The embrace consisted of a brief push to the chest. A pat on the back and the term, "I love you," were reserved for instances of affectionate contact between my parents. They were a model couple, exhibiting a high degree of compatibility and mutual understanding. However, my mother's affection towards my father was notably constrained, particularly towards me. It remains unclear how they developed the capacity to engage in intimate physical contact with one another. This situation is simultaneously perplexing and disconcerting. It is my considered opinion that there is no other individual who is capable of handling these challenges. They were fated to find each other or suffer alone in this world. I will now return to bed. Her frail figure disappeared around the corner and up the stairs. Prior to her exclamation, "Lock yourself up," I elected to deploy the apparatus that induced the vomiting and examine the consequences. There were 29 unanswered calls, 15 from Alicia, a few from Richard, and a few from other attendees of the gathering. I did not respond to any of the calls. It is likely that the calls were from individuals seeking information. After watching adult films, the wife failed to provide information regarding her husband's whereabouts. Despite several hours of restless sleep, I continued to experience pain, anger, confusion, and curiosity regarding the circumstances that had transpired. However, other emotions were more dominant. I also questioned Ed about the police response. I am uncertain as to the circumstances that befell Dominic subsequent to my departure. Did he seek medical attention? Did he file charges? Will I be incarcerated? I extricated myself from the residence before my mother awoke. I penned a missive stating that I was departing and that, should Alicia contact her, I would notify her when I was prepared to do so. She was free to take the children if she so desired, otherwise, I would bring them home at a later time. Fortunately, it was Sunday, a day on which I was not required to be at work. This was beneficial because I required a liquid and potent analgesic. The pain from the previous night was still present in my chest, and I needed something equally potent to numb it. I parked my vehicle outside my preferred establishment. I proceeded to a bar and entered the premises. Over the following 2-week period, I resided at my mother's residence. During this time, the only communication I had with Alicia was when I returned the children and retrieved a few items. After several attempts at conversation that were characterized by a lack of spontaneity, she departed, visibly upset. Before I left, I heard her speaking on the telephone, and I listened intently for several minutes. I remained awake for several minutes, listening intently in case she had been on the phone with that individual. Had she been speaking with Susie, I would have been extremely distressed. I was uncertain whether this was a positive or negative development. I spent the majority of my free time between my parents' house and the bar. My father was traveling on business, so I was alone with my mother. It was a challenging situation. She was not inclined to engage in lengthy discussions. To her credit, she listened attentively and offered support. However, I believe she lacked an understanding of the complexities of my situation. Additionally, I would never discuss adult films with her, particularly given her warnings about the potential risks of blindness and hairy palms during my younger years. During my stay with my mother, we spoke very little. I provided her with a general overview of my reasons for staying with her. She listened attentively but did not offer any commentary on the situation. She inquired about my plans for the future. I was unable to provide a definitive answer, so I simply gave a shrug. She responded with encouragement, suggesting that I would figure it out on my own. No further discussion ensued. The situation was, objectively speaking, rather detached. However, it was, at the same time, somewhat reassuring. There was no need to recount the events in exhaustive detail. Neither was I expected to provide daily updates on my emotional state. I was not treated with the same level of sensitivity and care as I might have been had I been in a different situation. The doll, which required careful handling and protection, was not provided with any encouragement to cheer up. I was permitted to grieve in my own way, taking all of my sick and personal days. Despite the absence of colleagues from the party, I was unable to face anyone. Our town is relatively small, and information travels quickly. The speed with which one gossiper reported to another. I was not merely dealing with a cheating wife, she had also destroyed me publicly, in front of everyone. Greg, for instance, is too tired to engage in sexual intercourse with his wife, yet he somehow manages to find time to sit in front of his computer and watch adult movies. Perhaps if he had ceased his online pursuit of silicone Barbie dolls and devoted more attention to his wife, she would not have sought solace from her best friend, confiding in her that her husband was no longer interested in her. How could he possibly recover from such a blow? Eventually, I had to disable my cell phone, as it was suddenly. He called repeatedly, and when I did not answer, he left voicemails. I am unsure if this was due to concern for me or Dominic's simple male pride. However, the police never arrived. It was interesting to observe how my friends behaved. I sent numerous emails and received calls from friends and acquaintances, yet none of them visited my parents' house. I have come to understand that when individuals are uncertain about how to respond, they often avoid the situation entirely. While my friends were not unkind, they lacked the knowledge and resources to provide meaningful assistance, and thus, they did not intervene. This was as much a source of frustration as it was a blessing. Since there were no other stimuli competing for my attention, I found myself dwelling on the situation incessantly. To mitigate the distressing images that persisted in my mind, I sought solace in alcohol. Karen emerged as a figure of both worship and deliverance. The most challenging aspect of staying with my mother was the estrangement from my children. It was a self-imposed exile, yet it was still a burden. I was aware that seeing my children would inevitably lead to seeing Alicia. I was cognizant of the fact that a warm bed awaited me, yet I was compelled to traverse a half-frozen lake to reach it. Consequently, I resorted to excessive alcohol consumption as a means of escapism. It was not until Karen introduced me to a narrative penned by a close acquaintance that I began to recognize the futility of my actions. I finally broke the cycle and reached out to Karen. She showed me a story that bore striking similarities to my script. It was called Catweasel, and it featured characters from various popular culture icons, including Tarzan, Superman, and the Hulk. I was enraged, so I pulled out my cell phone, turned it on, and angrily dialed 7 digits. "Good morning, Mr. Curtin's office. This is Betty, how might I be of assistance today? Richard, I am currently at Richard's residence. What are your plans for Alicia following the dissolution of their marriage?" Greg let out a quiet, sad chuckle and observed the plate in front of him. "Is it necessary for me to select one option over the other?" He joked, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. I could see the pain written on his face. I could see him. Greg was ruminating on the events that had transpired on Halloween, listening to her words. It was as if they were repeating themselves. "I have to ask," he began, "if this is too personal, I can be told to go to hell. What did she mean by an adult movie?" Greg's cheeks turned red, and he shifted in his seat. He was visibly nervous as he sat in his chair. "I occasionally view such films, but it is not a daily occurrence." "Are you implying that she does not appeal to you physically, or that you are similarly uninterested in her?" "Of course I view such films, but Alicia stated that you were looking at the film instead of engaging in sexual intercourse with her." "This is true." "Go to hell, Richard. It is too personal." "Okay, that is acceptable. However, I would like to understand what went wrong between you and your partner. I had always assumed that you were happy together." He looked down at his food as his fork circled it around the plate. "She just doesn't understand, Rich." "What doesn't she understand?" Greg dropped his fork and rubbed his face. He took a deep breath with both hands, exhaling a sigh that seemed to contain a multitude of emotions, including a hint of guilt. He worked 10 to 12 hours daily, and if he was fortunate, he only had to work 5 days a week. Upon returning home, he was fatigued and stressed. He had to navigate interactions with irate investors, clients, and managers, as well as address sexual harassment claims and instances of discrimination. All such claims, and everything in between, fall on me. If something happens in restaurants, such as a customer claiming to have seen a rat and extorting us for free food, I have to deal with it. He took a breath as if preparing to continue, and I waited patiently for him to lay it all out. Alicia requires a great deal of I invest a great deal of time and energy into foreplay. I typically spend approximately 30 minutes engaging in foreplay before initiating sexual intercourse. My wife enjoys changing positions frequently during sexual intercourse. Additionally, she requests that I engage in verbal sexual stimulation during sexual intercourse. I am deeply committed to my wife and believe that she is an exceptional individual. When I am well rested, our sexual encounters are highly satisfying. I am aware that many men experience similar sentiments. Those who complain that their wife is frigid, unimaginative, or simply wants to end the marriage are not the target audience for this discourse. However, I lack the fortitude to engage in this activity on a nightly basis, particularly in light of the numerous challenges I face throughout the day. He paused and averted his gaze. "Rich, at times, I must acknowledge that I derive a certain satisfaction from being alone. It is, however, difficult to deny that every man dreams of a woman like Alicia, a woman who is passionate about sex and eager to engage in it. I consider myself fortunate to have her in my life, yet I could see the pain that marriage was causing him. It is challenging to accept the role you played in your I do so much for her. For girls, I work my ass off to give them everything I didn't have as a child. My dad is very frugal, he only bought me what I needed. I want more for my girls. And then there is my wife. I enjoy spending time with them. They are my world. However, there are times when I simply wish I could. After dealing with the stresses of his work, he finds himself lacking the motivation to engage in the roles he assumes at home. He desires a reprieve from the responsibilities of being a father, husband, and boss. It has been a significant period of time since he and his partner engaged in sexual intimacy. Before the party, he expressed his frustration. He is uncertain about the length of time that has passed. I was unaware that such a significant amount of time had elapsed. I acknowledged this with a nod and then observed a sudden flash of anger in his eyes. While I recognize that she has the right to make her own decisions, I do not believe that she has the prerogative to act in the manner she did. Despite this, I did not humiliate her in front of others. I did not engage in sexual relations with another woman. She should have come to me. Why didn't she come to me without problems? I had to take a chance with my next statement. It was important to get my point across to him without making him feel like I was taking her side. Perhaps for the same reason you never told her why you watch adult films, communication is hard, especially if you don't. It is important to recognize the necessity of initiating communication. How might one inform one's spouse of one's displeasure? One might say, I am unhappy. This is a relatively straightforward approach. However, in certain situations, it may be more effective to introduce a humorous element. To illustrate, I once told my husband, I'm unhappy. He looked at me and saw that I was teasing him. He smiled and he shook his head and regarded us with a degree of skepticism, as though questioning whether we were truly idiots. I had assumed that the blow to the face had leveled us off, but it became evident that this was not the case. I found myself laughing at Greg's appearance, which, prior to Halloween, had been refreshing. However, this momentary reprieve was short-lived. At that precise moment, I observed Nikki standing in the doorway with a peculiar expression on her face. Her eyes conveyed a clear message: she needed to see me immediately. I excused myself from Greg's company and proceeded to her side. We have a problem, I stated. What is it, dear? She regarded me with a nervous expression and pulled me closer to her, as if to whisper. It became evident that Alicia was aware of Greg's presence. She was on her way. John, he probably called her to reprimand her, or he unwittingly provided her with information about Greg's whereabouts. This must cease. At the door, Nikki, I became angry with my wife because she had cheated on me. Have you forgotten about this? No, I have not forgotten. I have a gaping hole in the wall as a reminder. I turned to look at Greg, who was absent-mindedly playing with the food on his plate. He seemed oblivious to the imminent attack that was preparing to ambush him. Do you wish me to contact Nikki? She inquired, her expression softening as she observed my desire to assist my acquaintance. He must resolve this matter independently. However, you can be his ally and provide him with support as he navigates this challenge. He cannot evade it. She then patted my chest and departed. I proceeded to prepare Greg for what was to come. Greg, I heard. It would be inadvisable to make any further attempts at secrecy. She is en route. He rubbed his chin and winced, then a look of determination appeared on his face. Very well, he said, I will proceed. He moved away from the table and turned to me, his eyes meeting mine. I am prepared to deal with this, he said, his voice decisive. Greg, a beautiful sunset unfolded, displaying a kaleidoscope of soft colors across the pale sky, encompassing shades of orange, red, and all points between. It was a scene of such serenity that it bordered on calming. However, the serenity was abruptly disrupted when Greg's voice, filled with alarm, announced the arrival of his unfaithful wife. Instead of turning to face her, I kept my gaze fixed on the sky. Alicia interpreted my lack of reaction as an invitation, which was not entirely inaccurate. She sat next to me on Richard's back porch and pulled her knees to her chest as if for protection. I've been looking everywhere for you, honey, she said, which was not an optimal way to begin the interaction. I was in the air, repeated the same words I had uttered to her a few weeks prior, when I had caught her and Dominic in Richard's kitchen in a state of intimate repose. She regarded me with a slight expression of perplexity, as though she was unable to comprehend my response. Greg, I began, we need to talk. With her out of my peripheral vision, I could discern her agony. I did not look her directly in the face, but it seemed to me that it was a depressing sight: swollen eyes, flushed cheeks, and a sullen expression. At least, that is what her voice sounded like. I love you, honey. It's a lie. Please cease this behavior. It is unacceptable to simultaneously profess love and publicly humiliate another individual. I would never engage in such actions against you. What is the basis for your assertion? You are the one who initiated this course of action. I observed your rapid descent down the stairs, followed by your public inquiry. If Susie had been aware of my sexual encounter with her husband, I would have been removed from the situation and reprimanded in private. However, she was the first to broadcast the incident on the radio. In retrospect, I recognize that I did not perceive the situation with the same perspective at the time. My actions were influenced by a sense of shock and disbelief. I concur with this assessment, Alicia, but I did not instigate this situation. Your romantic partner confronted me and proceeded to inform me of your alleged lewd conduct in his presence. I responded in a manner that I deemed appropriate under the circumstances. I was enraged, but I recognized the justification for my anger. Could I have handled this differently? I paused to reflect. I attempted to control my emotions, but I did not engage in infidelity with anyone. I continued our relationship. You did not have a romantic partner who would confront you about my infidelity in a public setting. I maintained eye contact with her, and I observed the anger dissipate. He was replaced by remorse and guilt. I am acquainted with Greg. I simply shook my head in disbelief. Do you truly believe that Alicia is aware of the circumstances surrounding our relationship? I observed a resurgence of light in her eyes. While you may not have engaged in physical deception, Greg, you were not present with me. Do you recall the events of last night when I requested sexual intercourse from you and you declined? It was on my birthday and I had purchased some exquisite lingerie from Victoria's Secret. It was quite alluring and I bathed in the fragrant bubbles. In the bathtub, I allowed my body to become wet as I contemplated the events of the night ahead. I proceeded to rub my entire body with lotion that smelled like eucalyptus. I then spent an hour engaged in the process of styling my hair and applying makeup. I distinctly recall that night. It was the same night I was compelled to terminate Frank's employment. Frank was not only a close acquaintance but also one of my assistant managers. Over the course of my tenure at Olive Garden, I had developed a close friendship with him. When I arose that morning, I discovered that he had been accused of engaging in an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate. I immediately defended him, convinced that he would never act in such a reckless manner. However, the woman in question had sent him numerous text messages, which I later discovered. I was absent from the office that day. I had promoted him and supported him throughout his tenure. I was the only one who had to deal with the fallout of his actions, so I was in a poor mood that evening. However, I had not forgotten about her birthday. I made a reservation at her favorite restaurant and was ready to dine out. However, the only thing Alicia desired that night was dessert. You and I went to dinner for your birthday, and then we engaged in sexual intercourse that night. Alicia, I recall this incident. She shook her head sadly, and I remember her saying, "Greg, you couldn't even enjoy it. When I tried to embrace you, you pushed me away and said you were tired." Why I gave you space, her voice trailed off as she swallowed to clear her throat. I was aware that she was not yet finished, so I waited for her to continue. Then, I awoke in the middle of the night to see you in front of your computer, watching adult films and satisfying yourself. The words came out of her. With great effort, she gave up her body, shaking as she tried to cry silently but to no avail. I sat next to her, unable to utter a word. I began to gain some level of understanding as I listened to her express her point of view on things. This opened my eyes to a new perspective. Up until that night, she was perceived as an evil cheater. However, I was not sure who she was now. I comprehend Alicia's perspective. I acknowledge that I may have undervalued your contributions. Do you fully grasp the extent of my distress? Do you comprehend the pain of realizing that, even when you are at your best, you are not a sufficient partner for your husband? I do not believe you are aware of the depth of my feelings on this matter. After that incident, I resolved to no longer request your assistance. Sexual intercourse, I had hoped you would request this of me, but you never did. That is why you engaged in sexual intercourse with Dominic. Did he make you feel like a woman? She sniffled next to me and wiped her nose on her sleeve. Yes, Greg. He and Susie did engage in sexual intercourse. Damn it. Susie and I consumed alcohol on one occasion during our high school years. We engaged in sexual intercourse on that night. In the morning, we were both embarrassed and attributed our behavior to the influence of alcohol. However, approximately 10 years later, I found myself in a state of distress, feeling like the most inferior woman on earth. I sought out her residence, experiencing profound feelings of depression and emotional turmoil. I informed her that I needed to consume alcohol, and we proceeded to imbibe. The sense of inferiority persisted, though it did not entirely disappear. How did you come to be in bed with her and Glass Joe? Dominic returned home from work to find us in a state of extreme intoxication. Susie informed him of my difficulties, and he proceeded to describe me as beautiful and sexually attractive. She concurred with his assessment. The anecdote about our high school days emerged, and he became visibly excited. He encouraged us to kiss, and, given our considerable inebriation, we did so. What began as a playful kiss quickly escalated, and before I was aware of it, we were engaged in a more intimate act. When I finally broke away from the kiss, I observed him standing next to me. As he leaned in, I did not resist. From that moment on, our interactions intensified. The situation rapidly intensified. How many times have you had sexual intercourse with them? She turned to look at the now dark sky above us and whispered twice. The previous incident of intoxication was distressing, but this new revelation was significantly more troubling. At the gathering in the kitchen, what transpired? You and Dominic discussed her eyes, which flashed with anger and a hint of guilt, as she recalled the incident. He was intoxicated and had expressed his admiration for her costume and desire to engage in sexual activity with her that night. She was concerned that someone might overhear them, so she attempted to get him to stop. She informed him that she had made a mistake and that they could not continue as they were. Then, he became aggressive and began to rub against her. At that moment, you arrived. I informed him that I had made a mistake and that the three of us could not continue as we were. He then became somewhat aggressive, initiating physical contact with me. At this point, you arrived on the scene. I gathered my undergarments into a pile, recalling your instructions. She bit her lip and shook her head, expressing her displeasure. I was enraged by Greg's persistent harassment of Dominic. This recollection prompted me to consider whether you had ever valued me as a person. Had you considered going to his house later to engage in some form of sexual activity, given that he seemed to appreciate you? She shook her head and looked into my eyes. No, I had been hoping you would finally ask me out on a date. I had chosen the Catwoman costume because I knew you liked Michelle Pfeiffer in Batman. You once informed me that you had fallen in love with her because of that particular suit. I observed your eyes when you looked at me in it. I saw that you finally desired me. I nearly missed the party altogether to obtain what I had craved for so long. I wish I could do that. I was hoping that when we returned home, she then proceeded to recount how Dominic had entered the picture. She articulated his name with a degree of disdain, as though she were uttering a particularly distasteful word. She then inquired as to why he had not simply engaged in a conversation with her. Alicia shook her head in a melancholy manner and emitted a brief, mournful sound. She then expressed her uncertainty, stating, "Greg, I wish I knew the reason why I didn't do it." She then proceeded to articulate her own internal conflict, stating, "I guess I just don't know. There is sufficient culpability to warrant further inquiry." She turned to me with hope in her eyes. "What is the appropriate course of action now, Greg? I am reluctant to lose you. I love you profoundly and am willing to do whatever is necessary to overcome this challenge. My mind is in a state of disarray. Can I navigate this situation? Can I forgive my wife? Given my role in it is imperative that we leave the past in the past. A great deal has transpired, and it would require a significant amount of time for us to begin to heal from this." However, a glimmer of hope emerged, strengthening within her. She wiped away her tears and grasped my hand. "I will do anything," she said. "Please give me a chance to prove to you how much I love you." Into her eyes, I saw hope. I began to feel it too. It would take a long time, but it was possible that we could heal each other if we both fought long and hard enough. We would have a chance. "Okay, Alicia, but this will require several things. First, we have to go to a consultation. It's simply necessary. Obviously, there is still much to be done. We must determine how to communicate with each other." She kissed me on the cheek and hugged my neck. "Yes, honey. Whatever you say. Secondly, you should cease being friends with Susie." At that moment, I saw the light go out of her eyes and felt it die in my heart. "What did you say?" You said I should stop being friends with Sue. Greg, why are you asking me to do this? Should I choose between my best friend and I am unable to perform this task. Greg, I implore you, do not make me do this. I am unable to adequately describe the pain that coursed through me at that moment. It was, in fact, more excruciating than the pain I felt when I discovered her infidelity. This time, there was no rage to mask the pain. I felt my heart constricting in my chest, crushed by the weight of the. I came to understand that it was unbearable for her to choose her best friend over me. This realization was overwhelming and catastrophic. The woman I loved most in the world did not love me the same way. I was not her one and only love. I was one of them. I shared her affections. My emotional attachment to Dominic had diminished significantly. He was no longer a significant concern for me. Greg, I implore you, do not make your choice. Alicia was unable to sever her bond with Susie. This connection was evidently too strong to be easily broken. It rivaled her love for Greg to such an extent that she was reluctant to give it up. Despite the potential consequences, Alicia persisted in her efforts to salvage the marriage. However, these efforts ultimately proved unsuccessful, resulting in the couple's divorce a little less than a year later. The lengthy process was marked by Alicia's relentless pursuit to end the marriage, even to the extent of humiliating her own dignity. This behavior was unexpected, particularly given her reputation as a proud individual. Nevertheless, she resorted to visiting his workplace and pleading with him directly. I implored him not to abandon me in such a public manner. My entreaty was poignant, evoking unease in all who bore witness. I, too, secretly harbored hope that he would reconsider and offer her another opportunity. However, Greg was unable to tolerate her proximity as long as she remained steadfast in her refusal to renounce her friend. He felt compelled to disassociate himself from her. Share his throne in his heart. In essence, he was correct in his assessment that neither spouse should share. Now, a year later, the wounds are still deep. There was no clear victor in this situation. The two of them cope with the children as best they can, attempting to avoid putting each other down in front of their children. However, I have endured many nights as my friend was able to rely on me for emotional support during this period. However, there was one positive development. This Halloween, he brought a girl to my party. She was not dressed as Catwoman. She may not be his next romantic interest, but finding a romantic interest is still a step forward in the real world. People do not simply experience the loss of love, this is a step forward. The process of healing a broken heart is gradual, not immediate. Alicia, Dominic, and Susie did not attend the party. They ceased communication with the rest of us. Susie continues to support her friend and criticizes Greg for being unfair and attempting to force her to make an impossible choice. In my opinion, this choice was not as impossible as it seemed. Alicia simply did not want to be married as much as a loving wife should. She stated that she was ready to do anything. It is interesting how people use vague terms like do anything without defining what they mean. In essence, this implies that individuals are capable of acting in accordance with their own desires, regardless of the potential consequences. It is plausible that she was prepared to assume the role of a sexual partner or a devoted homemaker. However, when her personal values were at stake, her commitment to the marriage seemed less significant. In this context, it is evident that the relationship was not mutually beneficial. It is, therefore, advisable to consider the potential implications of such a union. Subscribe to our channel to ensure that your partner does not engage in infidelity. Additionally, we encourage you to listen to the subsequent narrative, which will provide a more comprehensive understanding of the subject matter. If you are under the age of 18, we advise against accessing the next story.